So good morning, everybody, and welcome to the annual Limerick Chamber Economic Webinar. On this Wednesday in the week, we begin to emerge from COVID lockdown. And also in the week, the Forbes editorial team emerge from a weekend of finding out all about the real passion that exists for Limerick. My name is Donncha Hurley and I'm the president for Limerick Chamber this year. We are delighted to welcome back again for our event, Carl Tannenbaum, Chief Economist, Northern Trust, and Dr. Katrina Cahill, Chief Economist, Limerick Chamber. As a small housekeeping issue today, Katrina will have to drop off the call by 11:55, so please get in any specific questions for her early, although we still aim to finish no later than 12 o'clock. This webinar aims to provide viewers with an outline of Limerick Chamber's Economic Insights report, focusing on the local and national dynamic which Katrina has been working on. Furthermore, as Ireland operates within a global dynamic, Carl will provide us with his perspective under the theme of recovering from contagion, epidemiology and economics. We'd like the session to be as interactive as possible, so please do say hello in the comment section at the bottom of your screen as we progress through the session. We will also include a brief Q&A segment at the end, so please post all questions or queries in the chat feature or the Q&A feature located at the bottom of your screens, and Caoimhe in Chamber HQ will be helping me to stay on top of that. First off, I would like to introduce Catherine Duffy, Senior Vice President and General Manager for Northern Trust, with whom we are delighted to partner again in delivering today's webinar. I'd now like to invite Catherine to say a few words on behalf of today's sponsors, Northern Trust.
Thank you very much, Donncha. And Donncha, best wishes to you in your presidential role. I know you'll do great, and this is probably your first kickoff event, so we wish you all the best in that, and always let you know that we're always here to help. So I want to warmly welcome you all here today. We're delighted that you could join us this morning. And I have to say it is really, really morning in Carl's world, as he will tell us. So Carl, a big thank you for joining us at 5 a.m. We really appreciate your time. You look wonderful, so well done to you. Northern Trust, we are delighted to sponsor this event today along with the Limerick Chamber of Commerce. So last year when we held this event, my closing comments were, I'm really looking forward to seeing you all in person this time next year. Well, little did I think that we wouldn't be meeting in person, and I'm so sad that we aren't. But you know, things, as Donncha said, are getting better and they're getting brighter, and we're going to hear a bit more about that from Carl and Katrina, I hope. So definitely, I'm going to say this time next year, we really hope to have Carl over with us from Chicago, and that we all get into one of the hotels and have this in person. I think it would be great. I know that Carl is disappointed that he can't be with us in Limerick today. He's a great fan and a great advocate of Limerick. We want to thank you for that. Next year, Carl, we're going to have you here. And I would like to thank Carl for his time. And also I hope that you'll tell us a bit about your St. Patrick's Day dinner that you had recently in Chicago. I think that was just fantastic. I would also like to thank the Chamber today for pulling all of this together, and in particular, Katrina and Caoimhe. Thank you very much for doing this annually with us. It's really important, I think, for everyone to hear what's going on, and this is a very good forum. So as Donncha said, I really encourage you to ask questions and ask them as we go through, and then we're able to catch up on everything. So now I'm going to say, sit back, enjoy, listen, let's hear what the future has got to hold. And I'm going to hand back to you, Donncha. Thank you very much.
So on we go. And first off, I'd like to welcome Dr. Katrina Cahill, Chief Economist, Limerick Chamber. Katrina has been working tirelessly on a broad range of policy areas directly impacting our region, and the Midwest Economics Insights, published annually, provides a clear context for some of the key metrics and gives us some insight into what lies behind the data. So over to you, Katrina.
Okay, thanks, Donncha. Good morning, everyone. So I'm just going to, as Donncha said, I'm going to focus on just a selection of the findings of the actual Midwest Economic Insights report, because there's a lot in it, and unfortunately we don't have enough time today. And as you can see, I'm having a bit of a technical issue and going to full screen at the moment. Okay, so what I would encourage you though is, as I said, there's a multitude of indicators that are in the insights that are out either later today or tomorrow. So please do take the opportunity to have a look at those if you can. Before I kick off though on the Midwest Insights, I just want to take an opportunity to provide firstly kind of some context, because there's still a lot of uncertainty surrounding the economic situation. we saw our restrictions extended back in March because of spikes in numbers, and we weren't alone in that. Several other countries have experienced the same. For example, Germany, and France has just entered back down into lockdown at the beginning of April. We've also had, let's call them, some hiccups with the vaccine rollout. And we had the very disappointing news this week about the AstraZeneca being held back for under 60s. And also the news yesterday that J&J were going to delay the rollout of their vaccine across Europe because of instances of blood clotting in the United States. So I think it's important to acknowledge that our fortunes, our economic fortunes, are very closely related to the rollout of the vaccine program. And the continued success of that is dependent on there being no further interruptions in the supply chain, and that's not something that can be easily guaranteed. Also, we won't really get a firm understanding of, I suppose, the lay of the land in the economic sense until government starts to roll back supports for businesses, which would be a challenge for them. It's a very delicate thing to do. They have to be careful not to do it too quickly. But at the same time, there's a lot of firms that are potentially being kept afloat by these supports. So we won't get a stronger understanding of what we're looking at in terms of some metrics like bankruptcies until much, much later in the year. But what is clear right now is that there has been a two-tier impact on the economy from COVID. So on one hand, we have the retail, hospitality and tourism activities that have just been decimated. And then on the other hand, we've seen significant growth in certain industry sectors like pharmaceuticals and medtech, for example. And it's because of that that the European Commission estimated that Ireland was the only European economy to see growth in 2020 in GDP of about 3%. And that's been driven by exports in pharmaceuticals and computer services. But anybody who knows me knows that I always caution against just looking at GDP as an indicator, because it does not tell us the full picture. If we look at some other metrics from 2020, we saw a severe contraction in domestic demand of greater than 7%. Ireland had one of the largest declines in nights spent in tourism accommodation, a 70% decline. Only Greece and Malta had larger than us. And why it's important to acknowledge those statistics is because we have a lot of people employed in tourism related activities. So on the one hand, you might be hearing news reports about a growth in GDP, but the reality on the ground is that for much of this year, we're still going to be in double digits when it comes to unemployment, and that's something that has to be acknowledged. So I'll kick off in terms of the Midwest Insights. I'm having trouble with going to full screen, so I apologize for that, but I hope you're still able to make out much of what's on the slides anyway. So for the first thing that I want to have a look at is the Midwest commercial activity by share of employment. And this is from 2019 to 2020. So as you can see here, industry grew its share by about 1.9%, not surprising considering how resilient the industry has been through 2020. Its growth is continuing as well because industrial production in the 3 months up to February was greater than 22%. You can also see that in terms of human health and social work activities, we've seen a share in their increase of about 2.5%. And why that's interesting is because that sector has now overtaken wholesale and retail as the sector with the second highest share of employment in the Midwest. Within this graph, you can also see the decline in share across the sectors that have been hardest hit by COVID. So you can see there a fall in wholesale and retail, accommodation and food services, and construction. So the Midwest is pretty much following similar trends and patterns that we're seeing nationally and internationally. So I want to quickly just talk about the unemployment rate. The Central Statistics Office reports 2 unemployment rates. So the second line from the bottom is associated with general unemployment, so individuals who are on the traditional job seekers benefit. So you can see there in Q4 that was coming in at about 7.2%. And you can see that that's increased every quarter since Q4 2019. They also reported COVID-19 adjusted unemployment rate, and for Q4 that was 21.7. You can see that that's fluctuated. So in Q2 it was quite high at 31.5 because of the restrictions that were in place, and then fell to 18.5 when restrictions were lifted. In terms of Q1 2021, official statistics haven't been released yet. But for my own estimations, we're looking at a rate in the Midwest of somewhere between 25 and 26%. And the reason why we keep those two rates separate is we don't know yet what proportion of people on the pandemic unemployment payment will be able to return to their work when restrictions are fully lifted, or what percentage will in the longer term move to the traditional job seekers unemployment. So what I've done here to kind of help us understand a bit better is I've broken down all of the income supports that are available right now. And you can see the blue line is showing the traditional unemployment, the orange we have the pandemic unemployment payment, and the grey is the wage subsidy schemes. So from this we can see that there's an inverse relationship between the pandemic unemployment payment and the wage subsidy schemes, not surprising. As of lockdown 3, so this brings us up to the very end of February, and you can see here that 37% of the Midwest labour force were in receipt of some form of income support. So quite high, but just to note, not as high as what we experienced back in the first lockdown, when that was at a much higher level of 46%. So obviously those figures and that data will continue to change as we begin to see the lifting of the restrictions, hopefully over the next few weeks. I want to briefly also talk about IDA supported employment because of how important FDIs are to the region. If you look purely at the most recent data from the change from 2019 to 2020, it doesn't paint much of a positive picture in comparison to the Midwest across the country. The border saw a reduction, but the Midwest saw the lowest increase in terms of IDA supported employment. But this is why I would always caution in terms of how percentage changes are presented. And that's why I've actually included the column there where that shows 2016 to 2020. And you can see the story completely changes when we look at this longer time period. And the Midwest actually comes in as the second highest in terms of IDA supported employment growth. So I think that's important to recognize that, because in terms of challenges facing regions with attracting FDI, it's really the border and the southeast region that is facing challenges, and the Midwest is actually performing quite well and is in a good position on that front. So what I have here is just to kind of give you an idea of what the regions are looking at in terms of the dual impact of COVID-19 and Brexit. So on the horizontal axis, we have the percentage share of employment in sectors highly exposed to COVID-19. So they're the ones I've already listed: accommodation and food services, retail, construction. And on the vertical axis, we have the share of employment in sectors highly exposed to Brexit. So for this one, we're talking about agriculture and financial services. So we're doing this against the state average, you can see in the center. And in the lower left-hand quadrant is where the Midwest is. And this is a good place to be because we have a lower exposure rate against the state for both the threat of COVID-19 and the threat of Brexit. Some other regions are facing significantly higher challenges, particularly on the employment front. So if you look at the right upper quadrant, you can see areas like the southeast, the border, and the Midlands, you have a much higher percentage share, particularly in tourism activities and agricultural activities. So I think that's an interesting insight when we compare the Midwest, where we stand in terms of the recovery against other regions as well. Okay, so I'm going to talk a bit about what we all love to talk about, property. So residential property prices index, this is from the CSO. Last year, midway through, or June or July, there was a lot of commentators who were predicting that house prices were going to fall towards the end of the year. And we published our first economic insights in September. And within that, we had mapped the changes in the first 6 months. And while it was true that there was a slowdown in the growth of house prices, we cautioned against predicting a fall in house prices because there were so many unknowns at the time. We weren't sure in terms of the vaccine rollout. We didn't know what further restrictions would come into place, how it would impact on the construction sector, and how it would affect supply overall. And also there was an interesting kind of pattern emerging in the economy as well, that a lot of the jobs that had been displaced because of COVID are being interrupted. was generally focused in lower income households. So we didn't know to what degree that would dampen the demand for housing either. So we judged that it was actually very difficult to predict what was going to happen. And we were right to be cautious, because even though we saw a slowdown in the growth of house prices across the country in the first 6 months of the year, in the latter 6 months of the year, we saw an increase in house prices. And you can see that pattern there that's presented in the Residential Property Price Index. And what I've done is I've just broken this down by county level. And what the figures that I'm showing here, we have the DAFT average asking price and also the CSO sales prices. And it's important to show that, because sometimes there can be a significant difference between asking prices and closing prices in terms of house purchases. What I'm also showing is the average price versus the median as well. And the reason for that is because when you're looking at county level data, you have to be cautious because you're dealing with a much smaller sample size. So if there's any outliers, they can significantly distort the average sales prices. So that's why I've included all of those data in the chart you see here. And with the exception of Waterford City, we can see significant growth across all of the indicators for the country. If we look at Limerick in comparison to the other Midwest counties, they saw higher growth. If we look at Limerick City in comparison on the right hand side of the graph to other cities in the country, Limerick also saw the highest level of growth, and also against the national average that we have there as well. If we look to the rental market, what I want to highlight is that we're dealing with two very different rental markets in the country. So Dublin and the rest of the country. So in terms of Dublin, you can see their DAFT average asking prices annually fell by about 2.1%, and there wasn't much change reported by the Residential Tenancies Board. But then across the rest of the country, again with Waterford being a bit of an outlier, we see growth in the amount of growth in rental prices. Now, a lot of people would use, I suppose, anecdotal stories there of people giving up leases in Dublin to move back during COVID to other parts of the country. And while there certainly is an influencing factor there, it's very difficult to measure that. So I'll give you an example of one factor that's influenced this that goes back to the data. And what we've seen is that in terms of residential tenancies being registered, there's been an increase in that year for Dublin and the greater Dublin area. So the residential tenancies increased from 7,235 to 10,258. But we saw the opposite across the rest of the country, where residential tenancies decreased from 10,034 down to 9,029. So that's also had an influencing factor there. In terms of the insights document that's coming out, I've broken it down further because there's also a story to tell with regards to new build and existing stock, and also former owner occupiers and first-time buyers. So check out that data if you're interested in it as well. There's also data on the commercial property market as well in the release that's coming out. But before I wrap up, I just want to also just briefly comment on the fact that when we do our Midwest Insights, we also do a business sentiment survey element to it. And that's shown some interesting results. You know, it's been quite positive in some ways because 74% of respondents were confident in their ability to continue to trade. We have 67% confident in the Irish economy. In terms of Brexit, a lower number than expected, 35% have experienced cost increases due to Brexit. And there's some other interesting insights that you can check out as well, like on remote working practices. Interestingly, that there's 10% listed that they'll take on a lower remote working practice level than they had pre-COVID, which I think just shows that grouping that's just sick of Zoom and wants to get back to higher level of normality. And we also have some insights on office needs, because that debate is taking place at the moment. And 62% reported that they would see no change in their demand for office space. 35% reporting that they potentially would see less demand for office space in the future. So I'll wrap up there. I'm happy to take any questions after Carol has done his presentation. So thank you.
Thank you, Katrina, for that oversight on the Irish dynamic. And now I'd like to introduce Carl Tannenbaum, a man who needs no introduction for the regular guests of our Economic Insight event. In his role as Chief Economist with Northern Trust, Carl briefs clients and colleagues on the economy and business conditions, prepares the bank's official economic outlook, and participates in forecast surveys. He's a member of Northern Trust's Investment Policy Committee, its Capital Committee, and its Asset Liability Management Committee. Carl publishes weekly commentaries and is frequently interviewed by media outlets including the Wall Street Journal, Bloomberg, the New York Times, and Reuters. Prior to joining Northern Trust, Carl spent 4 years leading the Federal Reserve's risk section. He was deeply involved in the central bank's response to the 2008 financial crisis, helped to create and conduct its stress testing program, and advised the senior Federal Reserve leaders on developments in banking and the financial markets. Over to you, Carl, and don't forget the St. Patrick's Day dinner story, please.
Thank you very much, Donica, and good morning, everybody. It is a treat to rejoin you. To Catherine's point, I very much wish I were there with you in person, but given the circumstances, I'm very glad to be able to join you no matter the hour, and would always consider an invitation to chat. As I begin, first, I want to express the wish, as I have to all of my audiences during the course of the last 14 months, that all of you are keeping safe and well. The number of hash marks on our wall is now greater than 365. My wife, for quite some time, Donica, was actually putting a hash mark on a piece of paper in the kitchen, almost as if she were a prisoner, not so much confined to her quarters, but the misery of being confined to those quarters with her husband was almost too much to bear. I'm pleased to report that she confessed to me on the anniversary of the pandemic that it hadn't gone as badly as she thought, although she had spent most of the prior 6 months trying to mix a batch of vaccine in our own kitchen in the hope that it would speed my departure from her domain. But whomever you are sharing your quarters and your life with these days, I hope that the dynamic has been a healthy one, both in a physical and also in a relationship sense. And with things brightening up, I'm hoping that there are better things to look forward to. As Catherine mentioned, one of the things that I use to try and take my mind off of everything that's going on is I do really enjoy getting into the kitchen, and whatever the occasion, we do celebrations of the Chinese New Year and other occasions. But St. Patrick's Day is a special one because my closest friend is an Irish American, first generation. And so they're part of our COVID bubble, and we did have them over in the middle of the week for a proper St. Patrick's Day dinner, which included a very nice Guinness beef stew, Kokanen with crisp leeks. We did some asparagus, some soda bread from scratch, and yes, Kerrygold butter on the side. And it was a nice way of getting your head out of everything that we're having to consider. And I hope that you're finding those outlets as well. Compliments to Katrina, who did a very nice job of describing the local conditions. I'm going to take it from 10,000 to 30,000 feet and give you a sense of how all of that is looking globally. As I begin, the same holds true today as it did in April of 2020, and that is the course of the pandemic will determine the course of business activity. And the two charts on this page are strategically placed because if you take the number of cases and turn it upside down, you have the map of restrictions that governments around the world have put on to safeguard their hospital capacity, their public health, and other things. Mobility has been very much restrained. It's good to hear that there will be a little bit more freedom granted to all of you in Ireland. Interestingly, as I look at the cases in the upper left and the restrictions in the lower left, Ireland does stand out as a country where the cases have fallen quite a lot, but the restrictions have been very slow to be removed. Certainly, you can understand the decisions that are being made there, but that trade-off between physical and mental health, between commerce and the public health are very difficult ones. And I really can't name a single market in the world that has handled that perfectly. We are at a stage where economies around the world seem to be generally reopening, with some exceptions. As Katrina mentioned, in the continent of Europe, they're really struggling with the vaccines and also the virus. And so France and Germany at the core are still very much locked down. In addition, those sectors of our economies that are dependent on international travel or supply chains are probably going to be facing impairment for quite some time to come. My own sense is that international tourism will be among the last things to come back as countries try and avoid re-importing versions of the virus that might be more pernicious. And I do remind people that while we often take for granted the way that products reach us of all kinds, they do travel through long links of supply chains that snake from Asia to Europe to the United States and North America. And with ports operating at less than full capacity, with factories having to observe public health restrictions, there have been a number of interruptions, and you've probably read about them. So even before the tanker got caught in the Suez Canal, it was clear that global logistics were being impaired. So for those who think that a new day is going to dawn, and as the restrictions are removed, everything will go back to normal, I just counsel patience, because it may take some time to get all the way back. A vaccination has proven to be the most durable way of dealing with COVID-19. And at the same time, I think a good vaccination program is the best form of economic stimulus that any country can pursue. And those that have done it best are those that are looking at the most the brightest prospects of economic growth here in 2021. Leaders on this front, even though they got a slow start, are the United Kingdom and the United States, where the UK is out in front because of their one dose for all policy, whereas the United States has really tried to get everybody both doses for the two-course vaccine. My wife and I got our second doses last week, and shortly thereafter we booked our first airplane ride in 15 months, which for me is a very unusual thing. Our son is graduating from medical school in the U.S. Army out in Washington, D.C., and we're delighted to have the opportunity to go out and be with him safely. And I hope those opportunities open up for all of you as well. But as you go down the list, you can see that Ireland is about equivalent to where the core of Europe is, which is a lot better than where things were 3 months ago. But because of challenges in allocation, and there have been some setbacks in some of the side effects, things are moving slowly. And the outlook for Europe more generally is probably the least optimistic, I suppose, as we have for the other major regions. The other thing I'll mention before leaving this slide is that we're not out of the woods with the virus itself. These things do have a tendency to change over time into forms that are more communicable and more pernicious. And we're beginning to see new variants that are a little bit more resistant to the vaccines that are out there, and also the therapies that doctors use to treat the symptoms. The longer that the virus is outstanding anywhere, it is a risk everywhere. And that is why you're hearing more and more from international authorities that developed countries do need to provide a bit of an assist to developing countries who have not had the resources or the organization to really get vaccines started at all. And some of the variants that we're seeing are arising in emerging markets like Brazil and South Africa. And what we've learned is that as hard as we might try and control our borders, those things do tend to find their way through. Now, as Katrina mentioned, on the employment front, there certainly has been a lot of work, and there has been a lot of money devoted by governments around the world to buffer the blow of what the pandemic has brought us. It's taken a number of forms, loan guarantees, employment support, as well as direct payments to households and small businesses. You can see from the upper chart that the United States, at least measured by the fraction of our national income that we've devoted to the effort, has clearly gone big, as they say. And we might even be going bigger with the most recent package that is beginning to be discussed in the Congress that is centered around infrastructure. And by and large, the size of the relief program has driven the pace and the strength of economic recovery. As you go down the list, though, and you look at the bottom chart, again here, emerging markets, which had finances that weren't as robust going into the pandemic, have been less able to appropriate the kind of monies that would support their businesses. And I can't help but think, certainly in the wake of last week's International Monetary Fund meetings in Washington, or I guess they were held virtually as all other meetings are these days, the warnings about an emerging market that could fail to sustain its obligations and its economic vitality are ones that we will have to watch. And as we've learned several times in the recent past, an emerging market that fails can have ripple effects that find their way all the way to Dublin, New York, Chicago, San Francisco, Tokyo, etc. Now, one of the things that I have been asked a lot, which is kind of interesting, because 6 months ago, there was concern as to whether we would find a way to recover, both medically and economically. And now with the advent of vaccines, that's no longer a question. Now the question I get most often, everyone, is, are we going to recover too fast? Have we done too much? Is the economy around the world actually going to overheat? And there are good reasons to worry about that, which I'll talk about in a moment. But we have seen inflation expectations, which might arise if the economy is moving too quickly, have really risen during the course of this year. And so have long-term interest rates. Irish 10-year rates are back into positive territory for the first time in a while after being at minus 30 basis points last November. And so that's not dissimilar to what we've seen in other markets. And that's really caused a little bit of a fright, at least, or did, in the financial markets. But to come to the point, I do think that we'll see inflation normalize. It's been very, very low during the course of the pandemic, but I don't think it's going to get out of control, because there's still a lot of capacity that we need to put back to work. And I know we're more prominently, and Katrina touched on this, than we have in the labor markets. You can see the American experience in the upper left and the European experience in the lower left. And because of what the Germans call Kurzarbeit programs and elsewhere called furloughs or employee retention programs, we haven't seen the official unemployment figures in Europe really rise that much. But as some of those programs wear off, as they should, as private sector demand for employees goes up, we are going to begin to see those labor market figures get just a little bit worse, even though in reality we're going to be putting more people back to work. The timing, as Katrina mentioned, of when you remove some of those supports is going to be very critical. On the one hand, you don't want folks getting overly comfortable on government benefits. On the other hand, there are going to be those in industries that are coming back more slowly that will legitimately need that support for a little bit longer. So I wish our public officials wisdom in separating one from the other. Now, as I mentioned before, as we visit today, the news is pretty good with all of the demand that we've got in the pipeline. Excuse me. The figures are looking better and better. I would mention that one of the good things, at least for economists, that have come out of the pandemic is that we are paying attention to really a new breed of economic data that tells us how things are. A good example are restaurant bookings. One platform that's global is called Open Table, and we saw reservations really plummet in the early weeks of the pandemic, but they're starting to work their way back up. I'm beginning to see more and more patrons in eateries here in the United States, and hopefully they're still being very safe. We're monitoring travel screenings at airports. We also get mobility data from, yes, your phones that tell us how far you're going, whether you're going to work, going to shopping. And I would mention, Donica, that prior to the presentation, I did get the mobility data from your phone. And perhaps you and I should have a conversation offline. It appears that you've been going some places that, well, maybe you shouldn't go. But anyway, we'll leave that to a 1v1 conversation. In any event, when you put all these together, you can get a sense of the energy in the economy and how people are moving out and about. Then all of that is getting a lot better. And so we're poised for some very, very good quarters of growth globally, which should begin to have the second leg of the recovery quality that brings a lot of people back to work and leaves businesses feeling as if they're closer to a full recovery. And part of the reason for that is, as I mentioned, governments have provided a lot of money, and households have put a lot of money aside because a lot of the things that we all would like to spend money on have been denied us: restaurant, meals, entertainment, travel, just among several categories. And I do think that as things open up and are safe, that families will return to doing those things, and there will be a surge of energy as pent-up demand meets pent-up supply, and we'll have a really nice spring and summer in most countries around the world. Now, I mentioned before, the one thing that still concerns me is, again, this notion that somehow we'll just turn on the switches and everything will work as it did before. I was recently working on some articles on supply chains, and in particular the ones for microchips, which are driving our lives these days and have become even more important during the course of the pandemic as more of us have been working and learning from home. There is a global chip shortage. Many of them are made in the Far East, in South Korea and Taiwan, and the demand has outstripped supply. They've gotten very expensive and they're on back order. And so again, while our demand for these things might skyrocket in the summer months, our ability to get them might not be matched. And so I think what we're going to see, and we did see this in the most recent inflation report here in the United States, we're going to see some surges as supply struggles to match the demand increases that we're seeing. But hopefully during the course of the next year, we'll be able to work out these bottlenecks. Now, the one group of people that I can say unequivocally that misses our former president are those who draw cartoons. This appeared on the cover of the economics magazine, The Economist, shortly after the inauguration, depicting our new president with a bucket and a mop trying to clean up the mess. And to a certain degree, that is in process. There has been a lot of effort made to get additional stimulus going. There has certainly been a lot more diplomacy exercised with our international partners. But I do think that many of you follow our markets very closely. I'm sure that many of you have relatives that are here in the United States. We are still a country divided, and many things are not going to change as rapidly. We're still enduring some frictions with China, which arguably are getting worse. And all countries that are caught in the middle, and Ireland does business with both of us, are certainly having to read those tea leaves very, very carefully. And in addition, we've gotten a lot greener, not just because it's spring, but the Biden administration has a very pronounced climate agenda, more aligned with what all of you in Europe are used to. But that's going to have a very big impact on industrial policy, as we are seeing as the administration begins thinking about infrastructure policy here in the United States. Now, the UK has had a very rough go of it. I was intrigued by this chart in the upper left that appeared in the FT that pointed out that the United Kingdom had its worst economic year in 300 years. Now, you have to be impressed by anybody that has 300 years of history. The only rival I saw recently to that, Donica, was the announcement by the government of Japan that the cherry blossom season, which is celebrated there as a real harbinger, came at the earliest moment in 1100 years. So somehow they've been keeping track of the cherry blossoms for more than a millennia. But certainly the issues that plagued the UK, no pun intended, last year were a combination of Brexit uncertainty, the pandemic, and a poor handling of it, and a government that was struggling to get their arms around things. The one thing that the British did well was that they were able to surround most of their labor force with furlough schemes, although Chancellor Sunak has threatened to remove those probably far earlier than they should have been, and thankfully he has seen the light. And the UK economy is looking a little bit brighter as we visit today, because lockdowns are beginning to fall. Pubs and shops around that country were reopened on Monday. I've advised our partners, Catherine, who live and work in the UK, not to rush right back into the pubs. You do not want to be in the vanguard on that front. But I also would note that once the fog of the pandemic clears, what is left is a very inauspicious start to Brexit. And of course, all of you in the Republic of Ireland are kind of in the middle of all of this, because things were rushed through right at the end. There was still a lot of unfinished business and details that really needed to be fleshed out. And as it turns out, the very tentative plans to handle border issues between the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland ended up stretching at the seams, and Westminster seems intent on trying to ignore them, work around them, and that has not been a very good situation for either side of the border. Certainly the violence that we've seen in Northern Ireland has many roots to it that go back a long way, but Brexit has not helped because shops in Northern Ireland, as many of you know, were dealing with immense shortages as the import routines took a long time to set in and still are not settled. And on the British side as well, one of the things that was not covered effectively were financial services. And we have seen a lot of shifting of transactions from London to other European capitals. Obviously, for firms like Northern Trust, we had to be very flexible and had taken steps in the years leading up to Brexit to make sure that we can serve our clients wherever they might be in an efficient way. But for other providers, this is ending up being a real nightmare. And I think that there's a long way to go before the consequences of Brexit are ameliorated for those who live in the UK. And obviously, as residents of that world neighborhood, these are also issues that you'll have to pay close attention to. Now, for the Eurozone as a whole, as I mentioned, the outlook is not as bright as it is elsewhere. We do see for countries around that area that the recovery is very much incomplete, and you do have some countries that are struggling more than others, Italy in particular. There has been a proposal for a continent-wide relief fund, but it has not been ratified by 12 of the EU members, and the German Constitutional Court has expressed objections as well. The support packages in Europe have been small, they have been late, and there has been fighting over their composition. And again, if you're keeping score, those are things, along with a high level of COVID cases, that are not going to make for a good economic outlook. I do think that Europe will recover, but later, and the tourism sector, very important for a number of European countries, is also likely to remain depressed for most of this year. And so those European countries, and I think of Greece in particular, Turkey further east, is very dependent on tourism, and those economies really can't withstand a second summer of nobody coming to visit. Finally, let me close on this note, and now that hopefully the pandemic is under a little bit better management, we are turning our thoughts to some of the long-term consequences. I thought Katrina did a nice job in her discussion of real estate, of noting that now that remote work seems to become more of a standard thing. I think the surveys show that a lot of employees like the flexibility of working from home. The demand for housing, the demand for office space is clearly going to change, and each country needs to take account of those dynamics. Secondly, the ability of an economy to grow is predicated on its population and its productivity. Population growth continues to be very slow in the major countries. There was some talk that there would be a baby boom created by the pandemic, but quite the opposite has occurred. And of course, borders have been largely closed to immigration, which is really very central to both Ireland and the United States as an avenue, not just for keeping up our numbers, but immigrants do a lot of innovation. They start small businesses and they are granted patents. And so as we look at the dynamics in the upper left, we very much have to make sure that there is room in our economies for those newcomers. And we do need to make sure that as we move beyond the pandemic, we invest in the kind of things that will keep us competitive for the long term. As a final thought, I know an issue that always comes up during my visits to Ireland are corporate taxes, and I suspect, and I've already gotten questions from some of our partners and colleagues in Ireland about the proposal from the US Treasury to have a global minimum corporate tax, which Janet Yellen, the Treasury Secretary, is going to be marketing. Obviously, that is a sensitive issue in Ireland, which has had a great success with its tax policy for corporations. I think there will be some momentum behind it that we should watch, but it's early days. And as I've noted during past visits in person to Limerick, it takes more than just a low tax rate to have a good business base. Talent, transportation, other infrastructure is also very, very important. And as I've always expressed to all of you, the Midwest of Ireland has done it almost as well as anywhere that I've seen in the world. And so, Donica, that's the view from here. I'll stop sharing my screen, and I'll look very much forward to collaborating with Katrina to answer questions.
Okay, so thank you, Carl, for that global overview, insights on the path to recovery, and for reminding me to always use my burner phone. And Catherine, I am available to volunteer for Northern Trust Community Service as long as Carl doesn't release any of my data. Now we'll move on to the Q&A segment of the event as submitted in the chat feature and the Q&A feature. So I suppose just the first one to Carl from a global perspective. And last year you made a comment about he who must not be mentioned. And but with the new administration in the White House, will Biden take a different approach than Trump in dealing with China specifically?
The style is very much different. We've already had albeit a testy, but we've already had a summit meeting with the Chinese in Alaska. It got a lot of headlines. It was called, at least on this side of the ocean, the disaster in Alaska, because there were some very harsh words exchanged. But as a veteran of seeing these things, the two countries did need to make those statements, if for no other reason than to appeal to the local populations that they were still going to be very tough. But I understand that there are lower level negotiations going on everything from technology to climate to North Korea. And so there's more engagement than there was. And I think it's, at least from this perspective, the group of people that Biden has surrounded himself in have a lot of experience and are able to use carrots and sticks a little bit more effectively. That said, the issues between the two countries remain difficult. I was speaking with Northern Trust's head of Greater China last night, Chicago time, to get his perspective on things. And he sees that there is the potential for healing, but it's going to take a long time. I would also note that while Europe certainly cheered the change of administration, I think Europe is approaching the new administration, and justifiably so, very carefully. Relations between the two areas have been testy, and I think it will take a little while for them to heal fully.
Thank you very much. I think we're all aware in this global dynamic that when America sneezes, everyone else gets a cold. And so it's very important on how those relationships develop and as well with China. Katrina, Carl addressed inflation risk rising, but within a local context, why has inflation in Ireland been so low for so long? And should we be worried about inflation? Say, for example, the question is within the next 2 years.
Okay, so in terms of why inflation has been so low, so for the last decade in an Irish context, on average, inflation has been about 0.6%. In the EU, it's been about 1.2%, so far below the ECB target of annual target of about 2%. There's a lot of factors that influence inflation. I think in a wider context, if you think about past experiences and when economies in the past approached full employment, employees would generally try to seek higher wages, and then that would fuel inflation. And if you look at some of the wage data over the last 2 decades, there's actually only been a very moderate increase in wages. So we haven't seen that pressure. Why haven't we seen that pressure? Well, there's a lot of theories around that, but globalization is probably the biggest driver there, because firms have had the opportunity to move production elsewhere when we've had labor shortages at home, or when labor costs have gotten excessive at home. And so that's definitely one element. The ECB as well, interest rates have been very low for a long time, and there's always been a hesitancy to go lower into negative territory. I don't think we understand it fully, or the implications of it fully. And it's, for a long time, it's been said we've needed inflationary fiscal policy across the EU, but it's very difficult to coordinate that. And that's exactly what happened in the last year. We did see coordinated fiscal policy, and you would have expected an inflationary pressure because of that. But at the same time, savings has increased massively, which has brought it downwards. So that's why we haven't seen much of a change in inflation in that sense. Also, like there's opposing forces at play a lot of the time at any point in time in the economy. The most recent example I could probably give you is that if you look at the period November to February, in that 4-month period, oil prices increased, which is an inflationary pressure. But at the same time, the euro appreciated against the dollar, which makes imports cheaper, which is a deflationary pressure. So again, there's balancing out. So there's a lot of different factors at play when we talk about inflation. In terms of do we need to worry about it? I don't think so. I think a bit of inflation is good. It means the economy is heating up. We just need to watch it. If it goes in excess of 2%, I would say 2.5%. But I think if we do, and we will see a bit of inflation, I think it will be moderate, but I think it will be temporary in nature, because remember, what's causing it? It's the savings. People are spending it. So it's a consumer, kind of a savings generated consumer boom, and that won't last longer term. So I think we'll start to see prices settle again after the immediate increase. So no, I don't think we need to be overly concerned about it.
Excellent. We sleep better now on that one. Carl, I think this question is to you, and I think someone has read, some of us have read that book, The Deficit Myth, and the question is fairly straightforward, and it says, should governments be worried about debt?
Well, it's a popular anthem these days around the world to say that debt doesn't matter. I'm just not willing to go all the way there. In the present day, Donica, the fact is that governments are able to finance themselves very cheaply, and in many parts of Europe, at negative interest rates. I believe that the budget expansion, as Katrina mentioned, was the only way, with monetary policy limited, to really get economies back on track. And because of the medical nature of this crisis, clearly governments are in the best position to try and shore up the public health, and any monies invested in medical care and vaccination, I think, have had immense returns. Had they not taken those steps, we probably would have been talking about something far more serious, and market performance, which wouldn't have been nearly as good as it has been over the course of the last 12 months, which is another tailwind that we have as we think about the outlook. That said, there may come a day where it becomes a little bit more difficult for all governments to manage their debt. I would counsel that they not pull the plug too soon, as Europe did in 2010 and 2012, which ended up slowing down the economic recovery just when it was getting going. But getting that timing right is very difficult, even if you were to leave it up to Katrina and I, because we would certainly get it right. But politicians, there you don't know, because they have a different incentive function that perhaps economists do. And I'll only speak for myself and the United States. Our politics here are incredibly complicated, and long-term economic outcomes are not always the first things that they consider, he said carefully.
Thank you very much. Spoken like a true confident economist there who has questions about all those politicians as well. Anyway, onto a local question for Katrina, and there's probably two parts to it here. The first one, and James Ring wants a specific mention. He said that high interest rates mean that in a recession we can reduce them to lessen impact. And now that interest rates are very low, we no longer have that cushion. And how do we deal with that if the COVID recession hits harder and longer than expected? And I suppose you already touched on the subsidies that a lot of our businesses depend on for continued support, and the reality that will hit as well as those supports begin to be taken off particular industries.
Yeah, so it is true, our interest rates are quite low. In terms of the ECB, they have a certain number of tools that they can use to influence the economy and to influence inflation in the economy. One is the bond purchases. So they can, now we've seen a significant increase in the purchase of bonds because they're trying to circulate money into the economy. But they can also do the reversal as well in terms of selling bonds to take money out of circulation, which will lead to increases in interest rates because it's a knock-on effect to banks. They also can change the reserve requirement. So every bank has a particular reserve requirement of funds that they have to keep. And if that's increased, then that lessens the amount of money that they have to give out in loans, which again lessens the amount of money in circulation. So there's various different mechanisms that is available to the central bank to deal with inflation. I would be more worried about deflation because there's less tools available to deal with deflation situation. So it is right to be concerned if we are in a deflation situation, but less concerned, I think, because I think central banks have proven their ability to deal with inflationary pressure over the last few decades.
Thank you. And Katrina, one last question to you, which is, do you believe that cities, and I suppose it's particularly for our own one, are at risk because of what is happening with COVID-19? And is there an impact as well on developments and timelines, for example, on local infrastructure around roads and things like that?
Yeah, so I think in the context of cities, there was significant concerns last year because we saw a significant decrease in footfall in cities with the closure of retail and the closure of office space. I don't think that was caused though by COVID. I think COVID exacerbated already existing challenges that were there. I think retail was in decline long before COVID because of the onset of online shopping. So this is a challenge that cities are trying to address over the last few years. For me, I think that the policy response going forward, we need to encourage people to actually be living in the city centres. And it's only when we see that happen, we'll start to see a revitalisation. With regards to the office space argument, there's been debates about, are we going to see the death of the office? I don't think we will. I think we'll change the way we use the office. I think we'll go to the office now a lot of the time with a specific purpose rather than just going and sitting at a desk for 9 to 5. But companies still value people coming together. on the innovation side and to exchange ideas. And I think that still will be in effect. We might see a hybrid approach with 3 days on and 2 days off, or vice versa. But I do think it's an important question to ask, because we saw the publication last week of our rural future. I think there's merit in the government coming up with our urban future report as well, because Limerick isn't alone in the challenges that it faces in driving activity in its city centres. So I think there's challenges, but at the same time, I think there's a huge amount of opportunity going forward as well, because we've learned a lot. And I think COVID has accelerated some of the changes that we needed to happen. So we've seen opportunity there, definitely.
And Carl, related to spending in the US, will Biden be able to get approval for the huge, is it the $2 trillion infrastructural plan? Will that come off?
As they say here, the path to passage is even more narrow than it was for the bill that just got passed. The bills, actually, that are being proposed go way beyond roads and bridges and broadband. They involve job retraining and a lot of programs that bring the government more prominently into activities that the private sector has handled. He has also proposed some tax increases to pay for some of it, Donica, which always makes the conversations very difficult. Right now, the Senate is evenly split between Democrats and Republicans, with the vice president holding a tiebreaker. And the House of Representatives, the larger house, there's a margin of only 3 seats. And so it's very, very difficult to come up with a combination of policies that will hold everybody together. The Republicans are certainly not collaborating or cooperating very much. So firstly, I think it's a lot less likely we're going to see everything. And secondly, if we do, Donica, it's more going to be for many years into the future, and not something that's as sudden as the prior packages have been. We'll try and keep everybody informed.
Okay, so thank you very much, Katrina and Carl, for those contributions and for helping to facilitate another great event. And now, as we approach the end of our webinar, I'd like to invite Catherine on Northern Trust's behalf, as sponsor of today's event, to say a few closing remarks, please.
Thank you, Donica. And well done, Katrina and Carl. You really have educated us here this morning, and thank you very much. Carl, I want to say big thanks for getting up at 5 a.m. to do this for tourism, the importance of it, property globally around the world and locally as well. As you say, our mobility is improving, but it is slowly, and I think that's the pace it's going to stay at. Supply change, climate change, Brexit, you've covered so much for us and really educated us. So I want to say a big thank you to us. You've left us with a lot of food for thought. Literally, Carl, when you were talking through your St. Patrick's Day dinner there, it was making me hungry. But I want to say a real big thank you. Thank you to everyone who joined us here today and for all the relevant questions. They were really good. This is a really important session to us every year, annually. Carl and Katrina, we really appreciate the work that you put into the slides for us today. So a big thank you from all of us here in Ireland, Carl, and a big thank you, Katrina, as well, from all of us. I hope everyone keeps safe and keeps well. And thank you very much. Donica, back to you, and thank you for all of your help and getting today organised as well.
Okay, so just to wrap up, special thanks to everyone today. Carl, who always provides us with such valuable global insights in a very entertaining and informative way. Along with your slides, we might get any special recipes as well, please. Be very welcome. We are very lucky as a chamber to have access to someone of Carl's caliber and greatly appreciate his time, particularly so early in the morning when he is 6 hours behind in Chicago. To Katrina, who works tirelessly to make sense of the data on our region, to provide us with the economic intelligence to help us lobby on behalf of our members and affect policy formulation, and most critically, how it is implemented to make a real difference for our region. To Catherine and Northern Trust, who are great supporters of Limerick Chamber, our sincere thanks for your continued support. And I would particularly like to thank Quiva in Chamber HQ for managing the nuts and bolts of today's logistics to make it run seamlessly. As a final note, a recording of this webinar will be available within the week, and for more information on our upcoming events, they are listed on the Connect section of our website, along with the Limerick Chamber YouTube page, which has all the latest recordings. So I just want to say thank you very much for everyone today.